All right. Thanks again for coming. I think we've got a good set of speakers today. Um, Nitrogen's always a fun one. Um, from a research and extension standpoint, it's fun because there's always something to work on, something to change. Maybe from a farmer standpoint, it's annoying because there's always something to work on and something to change. But I think we'll cover a lot of bases today. Um, and with nitrate being a problem in the news, we're going to talk about some things to maybe get out in front of it and some ideas we can work on. So I won't take any more time. Introduce Tim Mundorf from CVA. He's our first speaker, and we'll just let him take it away.
Green light, we're good. All right, so like John said, I'm Tim Mundorf, Central Valley Ag. I'm their Director of Soil Management, which, you know, that title, sometimes those titles you question what that actually means, but my job is I train our younger agronomists and newer agronomists, especially around soil fertility, but really around agronomy in general. I am a certified professional agronomist. I've been with CVA for about 6 years, and then I spent 11 years before that with Midwest Laboratories. So soil fertility is kind of the area of expertise for me, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, but mainly around the nitrogen issue. I always start out my talks, and I probably shouldn't since it's recorded, but I'll start it out this way anyway. Anybody want to take a guess of what the number one rule is in nitrogen management? You know, sometimes guys will say, well, you know, around a pound of nitrogen per bushel, you know, try to match your timing to crop uptake, you know, try to maximize your yield, whatever. No, actually, as an agronomist, the number one rule in nitrogen management is don't let the corn turn yellow or someone's going to call and chew your ass. And you're fired, by the way. So that's something we always try to keep in the back of our mind as agronomists, but as my talk today hopefully will show, we probably got some insurance nitrogen out there that we can do a better job of taking off the table. And because of the environmental impact of nitrogen, I'm giving this talk quite often now. So anyway, I always start off with the nitrogen cycle and hope that my young agronomists will memorize it, but of course they will not. A key takeaway of the nitrogen cycle, and we'll talk about as we go through this presentation, is there's a massive amount of nitrogen in the organic matter. And if you were to put these things to scale, this organic matter would be larger than the screen, and nitrate would be over here in a little spot, especially as you got later in the season when the corn's this big with tassels on it. The bottom line is there's a huge amount of interaction between immobilization, mineralization, between really nitrate, but also ammonium and organic matter. And that complication makes nitrogen management really difficult. When I work for the laboratory, I'll often get questions about, you know, can I pull a soil sample at tassel to see how much more nitrogen I'm going to need to apply to the corn crop? And the answer for the most part was no. You just have to put down a good base of nitrogen that should meet the crop's needs and kind of take it on faith that some of this that's tied up in the organic matter is going to get released through the growing season. Of course, atmospheric nitrogen is where our fertilizer nitrogen comes from with the Haber-Bosch process. But this interaction between these different sources of nitrogen, you know, we've got biological fixation here with our legume crops. With a good crop rotation, we can get some benefit from that. But nitrate's a very unstable form of nitrogen. So it's lost to denitrification in wet soil conditions, or it's lost to leaching where water's moving through the profile and taking nitrate with it, are both environmental problems for us as well as economic problems. So even though I kind of blow through this slide, it's pretty important. Unfortunately, just understanding the slide or the different components of the slide doesn't really tell you how all that's going to interact on any particular growing season. So I hope to talk a lot today about technology. We've got another speaker, Shane's going to talk about sentinel fertigation. We're a sentinel dealer. I'll talk a little bit about Adapt-In. We're also an Adapt-In dealer. Our inability to predict Mother Nature, the soil microbial life, the weather's impact on this movement between organic matter, nitrogen, and nitrate and ammonia is one reason I think we need to bring additional technologies in here so we can move away from just applying extra insurance nitrogen, and I, as an agronomist, don't have to worry about the corn turning yellow and getting fired. So the two forms of nitrogen that we talk about a lot in agronomy is ammonium. Of course, most of our fertilizers are going to go down as some form of ammonia and turn to ammonium in the soil as it reacts generally with water to pick up an extra hydrogen. And then the conversion is going to happen to nitrate. We like it in the ammonia form early in the growing season or before the growing season because we know if we can keep it in the ammonia form, it's pretty stable in the soil. It'll connect with the exchange sites on the soil. It's held. It doesn't move with water, and we don't have to worry about it denitrifying. Once it moves to nitrate and has this negative charge on it, now it doesn't connect to the exchange sites in the soil. It pretty much moves with water. It's in soil solution, and it is liable to be denitrified. So we like it to move with water. That's how the majority of nitrogen makes it into the corn crop or the wheat crop, whatever our crop is we're applying nitrogen fertilizer to. It moves with mass flow of water. So that's a positive once we get later in the growing season. But before we get to planting, before we get to where the crop is the general place that all the soil moisture is going to, then we've got to worry about losing nitrogen within that nitrate form. So this little slide here kind of shows that difference between when we apply nitrogen before the growing season and it becomes available. So the blue line is stabilized nitrogen. I want to say they used UAN as their form. So there's going to be some protection against volatilization of ammonia that if you weren't stabilized, you'd lose. If it was surface applied UAN, it's going to keep it in that ammonia form for a while until that nitrification inhibitor starts to lose its effect with time and temperature. And then you're going to start moving into the nitrate form and not the ammonia form so much. In the meantime, that corn crop especially has started to take up nitrogen, but you'll notice here before about V8, that uptake is actually fairly slow. By the time we get to around tassel, we've taken in about half of the nitrogen that corn crop's going to take in, and then through grain fill here, we're going to take up the rest of it. We want available nitrogen to that crop and probably in the nitrate form so it can move with mass flow as we move into late vegetative and early reproductive stages, but we don't want it in the nitrate form before that. And this graph kind of shows how that difference would happen with something like UAN if you were to apply both a urease inhibitor to protect it from ammonia volatilization and a nitrification inhibitor to protect it from converting to nitrate early before the crop can use it. But like I said, eventually we want it in the nitrate form so it can move with mass flow into the plant. So one of the tools we use is Adapt-In, and Adapt-In is basically a model. It models, it's multiple models, but it models crop growth and it models nitrogen behavior in the soil. So it takes the complications that we showed there in that first slide about the nitrogen cycle and tries to apply models to it to better quantify that. So as we know, when we get more rainfall early in the season, if we've got nitrogen out there, especially if it's already converted to the nitrate form, we're going to lose more of it. If we get less rainfall up front, we're probably not going to have as much loss. And adjusting our application rates, of course, that's going to involve split application, but adjusting those application rates based off of that weather, how much is converted to nitrate, how much has been lost either through denitrification or through leaching because of the amount of soil moisture. If we can calculate that better than just kind of our scientific wild ass guess that we typically do as agronomists, maybe we can make a better nitrogen recommendation and take a little of that insurance nitrogen off the table. So that's what Adapt-In does. In the case of sentinel fertigation, it's actually going to use plots of higher and lower nitrogen rates that are out there, and it's going to measure the crop response as we go through the growing season to those higher and lower rates compared to our base rate, and actually use the change in crop to decide if we need additional nitrogen or not. So kind of back to why this is so difficult. Like I said earlier, I worked for a soil testing lab for a little over a decade. And when you work for a soil testing lab, you get the lab resources and time on your hands to not do much else while other people are busy. So at Brown Silk on our farm, I just went out and pulled some samples because I wanted to look at how much nitrate was still in the soil, how much maybe ammonia was still in the soil, and just for giggles, I measured the organic nitrogen as well. Now, if you were to use, say, the textbook numbers, so like Nature and Property of Soils would tell you for every % of organic matter, you're going to have 1,000 pounds of organic nitrogen. And that kind of matches up here in this first sample. But we go down here to this middle sample, and with just 1% more organic matter, I've got another 10,000 pounds of nitrogen. We don't do a really good job of understanding this carbon to nitrogen ratio or mineralization potential of our organic matter. And frankly, I haven't got an answer for that either. But because of that, it's more difficult than we think from some of our formulas on how nitrogen's actually going to react or perform, or organic matter is going to release during the growing season. So some of these complications are things hopefully we can do better in the future, understanding how mineralizable some of that organic nitrogen is, or that carbon to nitrogen ratio of the organic matter. But this variation is some of the difficulty we see as we go across a field. It typically doesn't all turn yellow at the same rate. Now, a lot of times that has to do with how water flows through the topography of the field, where water's held more in that field, but it also has some to do with the variation in organic matter, and probably more importantly, the variation in the actual nitrogen in that organic matter. So we've got some research fields that we do our own nitrogen plots on, and obviously our land-grant universities do a good job of having a lot of research farms out there as well. This is our results from 2021 in Polk, Nebraska. We'll apply some fall-applied fertilizer. We did a pretty high rate that year of MES, microessentials, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, zinc products. So it's microessentials SZ. Applied that at a 300-pound rate. We didn't apply any nitrogen up front. We came back with 70 pounds of nitrogen with the planter that we put on as basically 20 gallons of UAN. And then we come back at V5, use the adapt-N model to see how much additional nitrogen it thinks the crop needs. Again, we had a 300 bushel yield goal out there, so it's pretty good performing soils. It had a good history of high 200s. Adapt-N called for an additional 160 pounds of nitrogen. We applied that as UAN. We applied a little bit of ammonium sulfate with it to get us some sulfur. We did all this at V6, and then we used a nitrification urease inhibitor combination on that UAN. We'd use the same when we did that dribble on the planter. This is surface applied. This is also surface applied. This was done with a band right behind the planter. This was done with Y drops, which basically creates a band right along the row. Use a polymer, use DCD, which is our nitrification inhibitor, and NBPT, which is our urease inhibitor. So basically we had 230 pounds of applied nitrogen on top of the original 30 that we got off of the fall fertilizer. Harvest yield, 318 bushels per acre across all the plots. We had 12 acres of corn plots out there. This is our best yield we'd ever had. Top plot did just over 340 bushels, and we got all of that on about 230 pounds of applied nitrogen. We like to talk a lot about nitrogen use efficiency, and I think the use efficiency of your applied nitrogen is something we need to focus on more and more. We had 0.72 pounds of applied nitrogen per bushel, 0.84 if you counted the fall applied fertilizer. To be honest with you, I don't always, because I question whether that'll still be around. But bottom line, we were running between a 0.7 and a 0.84. At a 0.7, you're actually about matching the amount of nitrogen you're applying to the amount of nitrogen leaving that field in the grain truck. 2022, we came back, did the same thing. We're at Polk, Nebraska again with these research plots, 70 pounds of our, call it dual dribble bank. We run a little splitter behind the planter to split it about 3.5 inches on each side of the row. So each side's got about 35 pounds of nitrogen. We again put a nitrification and urease inhibitor with it. Again, shooting for 300 bushel yields, coming back at V5 and making the decision how much additional nitrogen to apply. So in 2021, for that 300 bushel yield goal, it told us to apply an additional 160 pounds of nitrogen. In 2022, it told us we only needed another 110 pounds of nitrogen, so a 50-pound nitrogen savings over 2021. So why would it do that? Generally difference in weather, right? How much mineralization have you got? How much leaching loss have you had? How much volatilization loss? How much denitrification loss you've had? And that's all going to depend on weather. 2022 was a little drier spring than 2021, so we ended up with less loss and it told us we just didn't need as much, or maybe we had a little bit better mineralization as well. The model will tell you that. In the end, we ended right at 280 bushel corn, so we were a little off of our yield the year before. I would say, again, most of that's weather related and not our management, but who knows? I guess I was managing it more in 22 than I was in 21, so maybe I was the problem. 300 bushels was our top yield, and our use efficiency was 0.65 pounds of applied nitrogen per bushel. We actually didn't do fall dry fertilizer that year. We really pushed a lot at it the year before, so we didn't go at it as hard in 2022. So, that looks pretty good, a nitrogen use efficiency of 0.65. Well, we also have a research farm where we focus on organically raised grains. So that's generally corn, soybean with a cover crop in it. So in this case, it was corn following soybeans. We had a cereal rye, hairy vetch cover crop in there that we terminated in mid-May. We plant a little later in organic. Of course, we can't use synthetic fertilizers. I will tell you, in organic production, nitrogen fertilizer generally costs you somewhere between $3 and $5 per pound of nitrogen. So in conventional, we're typically paying somewhere more in that 40 cents to 60 cents per pound of nitrogen. Here we're paying $3 to $5 per pound of applied nitrogen. What we're using is a rendered byproduct we get from Darling. Our typical application is only 50 pounds of actual applied nitrogen. On those plots, we had 16 different replications. They averaged 238 bushels to the acre. That corn's worth about, in 2022, is worth probably about 10 bucks a bushel. You can make good money at that. We doubled the rate just to see how much better to do with 110 pounds of applied nitrogen. We were up to 260 bushel per acre. 50 pounds of additional nitrogen at $4 to $5 a pound for that applied nitrogen. When you're at $10 corn, that still works out pretty well. But we're able to grow that corn with a nitrogen use efficiency of 0.24 pounds of applied nitrogen per bushel. So we're mining nitrogen out of that soil when we're doing that. But we can grow some pretty decent corn with some pretty low application rates. So I'm not advocating that for conventional fertilizer, but in organic, we've been able to do that. So in 2022 in Polk, we did so it's back to the commercial side or the conventional agriculture, not organic. We did some split application trials. And I will tell you, I was doing these recommendations on the side as we were doing the planting. And I really questioned whether we were going to be able to hit these kind of yields with these recommendations. So the UNL recommendation for 300 bushel corn on a 3% organic matter soil there at Polk was 190 pounds of applied nitrogen. And I was making those calculations in April when we were doing the planting, and we were laughing about how yellow that corn was going to get. And that corn was 286 bushel. So we're laughing about how low this UNL recommendation was. But our check, which was the adapt-n base, which was what the rest of our plots were based off of, actually came in lower than the UNL recommendation at only 180 pounds of applied nitrogen. Now, it yielded a little poorer than the UNL rec did. And then instead of just doing our split application, we did a everything up front, and we did a split applied at the UNL rec, 280 bushel. The interesting thing was the all applied with the planter up front at planting actually out-yielded the split between V6 and up front. Now, I still recommend split application of nitrogen, but 2022 was a dry year. We didn't really see the benefit of the split application at this site in 2022. So CVA's recommendations. I told you I was laughing at the side of the field as I ran the UNL rec and saw 190 pounds of nitrogen to try to raise 300 bushel corn. And knowing that we'd raised over 300 bushel corn the year before, I thought that was going to be a disaster. It was not. It actually out-yielded our adapt-n rec, but the adapt-n rec was a little bit lower. Again, it goes back to if we take weather into consideration, we can cut down some of this insurance nitrogen. Our standard recommendation for that field would have been 270 pounds of nitrogen. So that's our standard rec, 1.2 times the yield goal. Take off that legume credit. For us, that soybean credit's going to be 40 pounds. Irrigation water, Polk just didn't have much nitrate in the irrigation water, so I didn't have a big issue there. Our credit for organic matter is basically 10 pounds for every percent organic matter. So we take 30 pounds off there. We had some carryover nitrate, but again, this is corn on beans, so we don't get a lot of carryover nitrate. So I had 20 pounds of carryover nitrate there. It gives me a result of 270 pounds of nitrogen. Now, there's definitely some insurance nitrogen in there, but don't forget what my number one rule is, right? Corn turns yellow, I'm fired. So I run UNL's rec against that, and this is the one I was laughing about on the side of the field, but again, it yielded very well and actually beat what Adapt-N told us. 35 pounds plus that same 1.2 times yield goal minus carryover nitrate. Here's the big difference between our recommendation and UNL's recommendation. The 0.14 times yield goal times organic matter. Now they do say you have to cap the organic matter at 3% if you're going to use that. So if you've got a high organic matter field and it's averaging 3.5 or 4%, then that number gets dropped back down to 3. But that credit, when you do that math, where it is, 300 bushel yield goal times 0.14 times 3, that's 126 pound nitrogen credit for the organic matter compared to our 30 pound credit with that. So that's the difference, and frankly, it makes us nervous. And then I brought in the other adjustments. At this time, we were 650 corn and 90% nitrogen. Since it was split applied, there's a timing factor there as well. That brought it down a little bit. So the 190 I did at the side of the field, the actual rec, when you bring in the price to nitrogen cost ratio and the timing factor at that time, brings it down a little bit from the 190 down to 178. There's a 100-pound spread there. And I guess that's kind of my argument in my presentation today is I'm not sure we're ready to drop to here typically, but we also don't need to be here. So that's kind of what we work on with our agronomists. We need to push split application, we need to push inhibitors and take some of this insurance nitrogen off the top and get closer to this number. These are our trials this year. So we moved to beaver crossing from polk. As you're running research farms, it's always a struggle to keep them sometimes. But anyway, this was all corn on corn ground. So we upped our at planting nitrogen to 30 gallons of UAN, so 105 pounds applied. Same split application, the same inhibitor applied with it. Come back with the V6Y drop again. We did a zero nitrogen check. It still raised 150 bushel with no nitrogen. The Adapt-N told us to add 160 pounds to the original 105, so it was telling us 265. Now that sounds high compared to previous years, but again, this was corn on corn. We raised 195 bushel there, and then our rec told us don't just add 160 pounds, add 200 pounds. We raised 204 bushel. Now this again is one site, has one replication, so basically it's 2 reps. Nitrogen use efficiency, obviously, you've got an infinite nitrogen use efficiency when you don't apply any nitrogen. We're at a 1.36 with the Adapt-N rate and a 1.5 with the CVA rate. The odd thing is just that extra 9 bushels of corn actually made the CVA rate the most profitable. Now here's the key thing in this set of trials. We had a tremendous July 4th hailstorm come in through there. Where our shop is at by Waco, those crops are just wiped out completely. The pivots turned over, everything. We've got about 50% defoliation. You run that through the Purdue guide, to estimate a yield loss. It says about a 25% yield loss. So we probably lost 50 bushel just in the hailstorm. So how this would have been different, I don't know. This is what the results were, right? You use what the results are, not what you think they should be. Dr. Wortman told me that a long time ago. In more average yield environments, that's where our recommendations between, say, us and UNL comes a lot closer together. So 210 bushel dryland corn following soybeans on soil with 2% organic matter and 25 pounds of carryover nitrate. You run that through our equation, we'd have 167 pounds would be our recommendation for that corn on beans, 210 bushel yield goal. My old employer, it'd be a little over 200 pounds. Again, you're never too far off with a pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn, but generally there's some insurance built into that. UNL's rec just about matches ours. Iowa State's rec, and that's where I'm from, is Western Iowa. We have a hard time with that one, but to be honest with you, historically, that's been their most profitable return to nitrogen. It is 135 pounds on corn on beans. I think they run about 50 pounds higher on corn on corn. You run that through the tri-state recs, it's 204. You run that through Kansas State's rec, and they recently changed theirs. They were a 1.6 multiplier. I think they've dropped that down to a 1.4 now. But when they're at that 1.6 multiplier, it's 230 pounds of nitrogen. And one of the things one of my big takeaways is, there's fields in northeast Kansas and fields in southwest Iowa that aren't that far apart, and there's a 100-pound spread there in that recommendation. So an old agronomist I used to call on back in south central Iowa used to tell me, when you guys figure out nitrogen, you come visit me in the nursing home and tell me how it really works. And I think I'll tell any young agronomist the same thing because I'll be in the nursing home before anybody else figures it out either. This is what we get from Adapt-In. So this is the inputs I have to give it. A planting date, maturity of my corn, what my previous crop was. Now, we'll zone this, but since these are my research plots, it really isn't true zones. I just deal with the average, so that's pretty much the number to focus on. Looking at those polk plots, 3% organic matter, we were planting a 35,000 population. Again, we'd hit 300 bushel in the past, and we're typically running in that 270 to 290 range. So that's a yield, or a realistic yield goal. We had good soil pH. We managed our soils pretty well. This is what we put down as our pre-plant, or really at planting, and the fact I use Agritane in there because we have our own proprietary product, but it's closest to probably Agritane. So anyway, 70 pounds of nitrogen at planting, and you come back and run it. And again, since these zones are so small, it's a 140-acre field, but our plots are pretty much about here. That average is the right number. For 2022, at the end of the crop year, so I said when we ran that at V5, it was telling me 110 pounds of nitrogen. Later in the crop season, it's telling me I needed just a little bit more than what it had told me back in June. Now, my problem there is, yeah, I've got a pivot, but I can't fertigate that. That'll screw up all of my plots. So I have to make decisions by V6. So coming back later, in August and it telling me something different, well, it doesn't help me any because, and that's one of the reasons we put down insurance nitrogen, right? We can't always wait till the end of the season to say, oh yeah, I needed another 20 pounds. Fly it on with an airplane, but that's the only option I would have had on that field. Key thing about this slide is it really shows you how that recommended, I'll just stick with this average number here. So again, it's got a low, medium, and high based off your zones. For the most part, these are very similar because it's a fairly small field, 140 acres, and my plots are only about 30 acres of it. But in 2022, it's telling me I needed 122 pounds. In 2021, it's telling me I need an additional 20 pounds. 2020, it's about 10 pounds less than 21, but 10 pounds more than 22. 2019, which must have been quite a bit wetter year, it's telling me I need 50 pounds of additional nitrogen compared to what I need in 2022. Typically, what we do as an industry and as growers is we're going to apply the same amount of nitrogen all those times, even though the weather, as you run it through this model, tells you need different amounts. So bringing some of this technology in is going to give us a tremendous opportunity to reduce some of our application rate because we're going to rely on the tool to tell us whether or not we need as much insurance nitrogen as we think we do. You go back to 2012 where we had the drought, it's telling me that with my 70 pounds up front, I only need an additional 90 pounds. 160 pounds of nitrogen, this tool is telling me it'll raise 300 bushel of corn. Now, that's assuming I can get enough water on it to raise 300 bushel of corn. But the bottom line is it'll tell me whether or not I need additional nitrogen. Some additional information it'll give you is it'll give you average loss numbers, average mineralization numbers, and then of course it's giving you what your rainfall's been since planting and then since November of the year before. You see how little rainfall they had in 12, fairly low numbers in 2022, but like in 2021, it was not as much since planting when we made this decision, and this time I said September, but before fall, so what we would have had left over from say mineralization from the fall before, we would have lost more of that because we had a significant amount of rainfall, additional rainfall in 21 than 22. That's probably one of the reasons for the higher recommendation. All right, switch gears on you a little bit. So this is Milford Lake in Kansas, USGS photo. We've got a facility about 15 miles away from this lake. Now, generally, algal blooms in freshwater are going to be caused more by an imbalance of phosphorus than an imbalance of nitrogen. But just to kind of show you how much we in agriculture are really interacting with the public, and this lake is pretty popular with people coming from, say, Topeka, Junction City, or even Kansas City for recreational use. When we've got a facility 15 miles away from this lake, how we manage our nutrients is pretty important. So this is where I grew up in western Iowa. So when I did my master's at Lincoln, I used this water body. This is Walnut Creek. It's about 50 miles straight east of Omaha in western Iowa. I used this water body and then the nitrates and phosphorus in our tile line discharge as my master's project. So that water body, that stream, or it's really kind of a small river, flows into the Nishnabotnas in western Iowa. runs about 10 part per million, which obviously is right at the safe drinking water limit set by EPA. So in 2016 and 2017, I did 2 years of measuring about every month the nitrate levels in that water body, pretty much right where the creek coming from our farm met that stream and where our tile line discharge would have gone to. 2016, it was a wetter year, average 10 part per million. In 2017, a drier year, actually had quite a bit lower flows, especially late summer and fall, and lower nitrate levels, and averaged about 8 part per million. So here's one of the tile line discharge points. That was kind of the point of my project at that time, is the city of Des Moines was suing the Raccoon River drainage basin for their tile line discharge nitrates because they're creating problems with their treatment plant. 2012 was that big drought. 2013, we had a pretty good flush of water. When you have a big drought and nothing's going through the tile line and you get a big flush of water, I guarantee you there's going to be nitrates in it. And that's going to happen again this year. Well, if we get the rain. I pray it happens again this year because it means we got rain. I tried to do this test again this year in 2023. How many sampling events do you think I had? The answer is none. There was never water flowing through that tile line the entire year from March through December. Anyway, so here is 16 and 17. This is this sampling point where it comes from our field down into the creek. So this is basically our tile line discharge nitrate levels and phosphorus levels. And for the most part, we get phosphorus levels below the detection limit of the laboratory. Everything was non-detect in 2017. Like we know, phosphorus just doesn't move through the soil, so you don't expect to see it in tile line discharge. Now we see a little bit there. That's because it's a terraced field, so we actually have inlets at the top of the terraces to let water out so that it doesn't overflow, and we have to rebuild them. So there's a little surface water flow into that. But on average, we ended up at about 10 part per million in 2016. Not a lot of range there, really, pretty much between 9 and 11 part per million. Come back in 2017, same field, same tile line outlet, average basically the same, right at 10 part per million. A small crowd here today, but what's the takeaway between 17 and 16? Pretty much the same nitrate levels, right? 17 was corn and 16 was soybeans. How much nitrogen did I apply to our soybeans? None. So even under soybeans, and again, the tile lines are probably running between 4 and 6 foot deep, so it's not a short-term fix. It's not an easy short-term fix. You talk about the grower, hey, reduce your rates, use some cover crop. It can be an opportunity to really drop the nitrates in your tile line discharge, your nitrate leaching. It's going to take years to make much of a difference because I saw no difference in a single crop year, even though we're applying no nitrogen to the soybean crop. Total loading, and there's 2 different farms here. I didn't give you the data from Stewart. That's a little further north. That's my wife's family farm. Nitrate levels in the discharge are actually a little bit higher. They're fall applied ammonia. This was spring applied ammonia. It might make some difference there, but again, corn versus soybeans, we're not applying any ammonia in our soybeans, but over multiple years, the same practices. We saw a little bit lower levels here than what we did up here, but organic matter is a little higher here too. You look at total loading and divide that, so of course you multiply that concentration by the amount of water moving through the system, then divide that out by the acres that was servicing. The total loading was fairly small. I mean, if I'm within 20 pounds of the right nitrogen rate on any given year as an agronomist, I consider myself lucky. Our loading was between 5 and 10 pounds an acre. We were losing going through that tile line discharge. So as we talk about best management practices, I'll go back to that. Minimizing the time nitrates are present. That can either be through inhibitors or that can be through split application and just not putting the fertilizer on until later. Delaying applications, nitrification inhibitors. A good yield goal based recommendation, but not over applying. And again, nitrogen is probably the #1 factor that we control that affects yield as an agronomist, as a farmer. So there's a lot of temptation to just make sure we've got it covered, and that's not a limiting factor with quite a bit of insurance nitrogen, probably more than we need to apply, and that's something we probably need to get away from. And then this last part, nitrate leaching is an economic issue, but it's also an environmental, and now it seems like we're coming to more and more of a health concern. So here's a trial I did with one of my growers. I spent quite a bit of time on this field up by Pender. So they'd raised 270 bushel corn in the past on this field. I got brought in because they were really trying to get to 300 bushel corn. So as an agronomist, I was able to help them move from 270 bushel corn down to 190 bushel corn. That was a real success. But one thing I'd asked them to do is to try using an inhibitor. So they do fall applied anhydrous ammonia at about 170 pounds of nitrogen. They come back with another 30 pounds of nitrogen as a weed and feed. Total of 200 pounds of nitrogen, again, capable of raising 270 bushel corn. They proved it in the past on that nitrogen. So we're fairly comfortable with it. I said, you know what, we'd really like you to try using an inhibitor. So the red is the no inhibitor, the blue is the inhibitor spread out across this field. So basically we did passes with an inhibitor and did passes without an inhibitor. Blue's the inhibitor, the red's not the inhibitor. Where we applied the inhibitor, so the blue, we raised 187 bushel corn. Where we didn't apply the inhibitor, the red, we raised 190 bushel corn. So according to this, the inhibitor did not work. That's one of our challenges, is we use yield a lot as our decision of whether or not an inhibitor works or not. Did the inhibitor work? I don't know from this data set, right? I mean, the bottom line is nitrogen was not a limiting factor for that corn crop, which really shouldn't surprise you when you're corn on beans and you put down 200 pounds of nitrogen and you raised 190 bushel corn. Everybody knows that should be enough nitrogen. Well, fortunately, during the growing season, we were out there pulling samples, and we pulled soil cores where we had the Centuro and where we didn't have the Centuro. And what we found was where we had the Centuro, about 2/3 of the nitrogen was in the top foot, and about 1/3 of it, as you looked across what total was in the top 2 feet, 2/3 is in the top foot, 1/3 is in the bottom foot. Where we didn't have the Centuro, about 1/3 was in the top foot, and about 2/3 was in the bottom foot. Pretty much flipped. Total amount of nitrate, the same. But essentially where it was in the soil profile, it was quite a bit higher where we used the inhibitor, and it had gone quite a bit lower where we didn't use the inhibitor. We also measured ammonia, so this sample was done in early June. There was still a little bit more ammonia where we'd used the Centuro in the shallow sample than where we hadn't. Now, I would expect most of my ammonia is going to have converted to nitrate by June when we applied it in November, but there was actually still a little bit more hanging out behind, say, the background numbers where we had the Centuro. But the bigger issue was where it was holding the nitrate higher in the profile because of the later conversion where we used the Centuro. But again, as far as the grower was concerned, you think I sold him Centuro the next year? I did not, which probably was well, he had a little bit better yields. No, that's wrong. So I was 22, so he had 190 bushel yield in 2022. What do you think he did in 2023 on the field just north of there that was corn? 80. Tremendous drought, so 80 bushel corn. So yeah, I've moved him from 270 down to 80. Mother Nature might have something to do with it. This is our family farm in western Iowa. I am a pretty big believer in cover crops. We fly on cereal rye in September onto both our corn and soybean ground, but especially on our corn ground. It does a good job of picking up some of that mineralized and any excess leftover nitrogen. It's not great. I mean, we're going to kill it not too long after that. We might let it get to a foot. We haven't tried planting green yet. My brother-in-law called me this year and said, hey, I'm thinking about planting green. And I said, no, you're not. We have not got near enough rainfall for that. But in years where you got good rainfall, it actually soaks up water about as well as it soaks up nitrogen. This is our research plots over where we do organic fields. Again, I like capturing that nitrogen with that cover crop. Here we're also trying for biological diversity, which we're required to do in organic cropping. All right, so talk to you all about splitting up application, less insurance nitrogen, using inhibitors, all what I consider the best management practices that we're going to advocate as a co-op. Well, what's the problem with that? Now, here's one. So when I did these numbers, we were at 40 cents. This was this summer. We were at 40 cents per pound nitrogen. I can apply 200 pounds of fall anhydrous ammonia. It's going to cost me $80 an acre. I can drop 20 pounds of nitrogen and do 180 pounds of fall applied anhydrous ammonia and then add Centuro to it. But overall, even though I drop 20 pounds of nitrogen at 40 cents a pound, overall I'm going to be spending more on nitrogen than if I just applied 200 without messing around with the Centuro or cutting back my nitrogen rate. Now, even better practice would be to drop that fall applied anhydrous ammonia down to 125 pounds and then come back and pay the co-op to put on urea at V6. Now, the nitrogen is going to be a little more expensive as urea than it is going to be as ammonia, but I'll drop it down to about 170 pounds total, so that's 46 of urea, that's 100 pounds of urea, 125 pounds of fall applied anhydrous ammonia nitrogen. But you add the nitrogen cost to the extra application cost, and now you moved up to 88.60. So you dropped 30 pounds of nitrogen, but it cost you $8.60 an acre more. And you say, well, you know what? I'm going to be the best management practice. I'm going to do Centuro with the anhydrous ammonia, and I'm going to do a nitrification inhibitor. We sell our own called CVA Protect Urea. It's really an original name. I had to think real hard to come up with that one, but it's both a nitrification inhibitor, a urease inhibitor. We add all that into it, and now I'm at $100 an acre, 102 basically. So I saved 30 pounds an acre in nitrogen application, but cost me $20 an acre more. And I yield the same. That's our challenge. And then here's our other one. This one's my favorite. So I give a nitrogen talk quite often, and years ago I was giving one we had a precision ag university I used to run. We'd bring guys in as Midwest Labs to talk to them about, variable rate application, grid sampling, but we talked about variable rate nitrogen as well. And I was giving my nitrogen talk, and my phone started ringing, and I was just using it to keep time. But who do you think was calling me? It was my brother-in-law. And why do you think he was calling me? Because the corn was turning yellow. I'm literally up here giving the talk to agronomists about how to make their nitrogen recommendations, and my phone is ringing because the corn and the recommendations I made was turning yellow. What we often do is we get a year where things go yellow and we say, you know what, I'm not applying enough nitrogen, and we add 25 pounds. And that's our recommendation going forward because it's not a limiting factor now. It wasn't going to be a limiting factor anyway. Let's just say you're doing 200 pounds of nitrogen, you're typically raising 225 pounds or 225 bushel corn. Well, you get a year that goes against you and it turns yellow. Now you're doing 225 pounds of nitrogen, still raising 225 bushel corn. So your rec just goes to whatever the last number was that's a little higher than when it last turned yellow. The positive. So this is not in your slide because this is our own data. But our total tons of nitrogen that we sell has been trending downward. And actually the total number of acres we service has probably been trending upward with mergers and everything. That's going to vary a lot depending on the balance of corn to soybean year to year. But I'd say overall we're applying less nitrogen per bushel. And we're probably applying a little less nitrogen per acre as well. And the amount that's treated with an inhibitor has slowly been increasing. We were running around 30%, we're getting closer to 40%. So the bottom line is, even though the economics, tell you that maybe you should just go ahead and do everything as fall applied anhydrous ammonia and not worry about it, just throw on 20 pounds extra, what we're seeing is we're doing the right thing. But we can do better. Again, there's a lot of gap between what the crop really needs and what we apply because we apply a significant amount of insurance. If I don't leave you with anything else, there's some opportunities to use some technology to get better at it. So that's my contact info. Any questions? All right, well, thank you. Yeah.
No-till, I saw that last slide you had. All the rest of them no-till.
Everything I'm showing you except for the organic is no-till. Organic and no-till don't go together, but that's a whole nother presentation. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions for Tim? All right, let's give him a hand. That was really, really good. So we've got two sponsors today. First sponsor is Lancaster County Farm Bureau. Bruce Tiedemann, the president, was supposed to be here, and he had a funeral come up. So I'm going to make his plug for him. They've sponsored this program quite a bit in the past, so they've been a good partner, and going to toss things around. So Bruce gave me some high points that he would have talked about. So in Lancaster County, if you're not a member, membership's $53 a year. And the way Bruce explained it, they have so many different partners in retail and whatnot, you can pretty easily recoup that membership fee. For example, Ford, Choice Hotels, Granger, Deere, Case, Yamaha. So if you're, and there's a whole list, if you're going to go out and make a purchase anyway, chances are Farm Bureau is a partner, and they'll cut you a little deal on that. So that's what Bruce wanted to highlight. So if anybody's not a member and you're thinking about it, seems like a pretty good deal. NEFB.org, and then you can find your county. They're different. The membership rates are a little different depending on the county. So we'd just like to thank Lancaster Farm Bureau for sponsoring. Really appreciate all the sponsors. And if you have any questions, Bruce said you could find him on the website and call him. I know he always answers when I call him, and I'm usually asking him a favor, and he still answers. So thanks again to the Farm Bureau, and